Colleagues, welcome back. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of what is turning out to be a really important and fascinating policy and business forum of the Second International Congress on Agrobiodiversity. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the market signals that policymakers can give to drive change and the role of food composition data to support decision making. Today, we are here to discuss how to make food systems more nature positive, more prosperous, and more inclusive. Systems that work for different people and cultures, and systems that also make the wealth of genetic resources an opportunity for transformation. This morning, we listened to the scientists. They spoke to us about transforming production systems, farm diversity, and climate resilience to improve the delivery of ecosystem services and sustain production. This is very close to my heart as the managing director of the global mechanism at UNCCD. At UNCCD, we focus on ensuring the supply of healthy and productive land and water in situations of scarcity. As Mark Twain once put it, buy land, they aren't making it anymore. The conservation, sustainable management, and restoration of land and natural resources is critical for the transformation to nature positive production. But we also heard from Indigenous peoples about how relevant it is to focus on neglected and underutilized species to identify the biodiverse foods of tomorrow. This afternoon, we are bringing together policymakers, small, medium, and large businesses, international organizations, and a group of really highly relevant stakeholders covering an incredible spectrum of food systems issues. And we're going to get practical. Our goal really here is to reflect on how we can move forward with food systems transformation in the real world. What kind of multi-stakeholder platforms are actually needed? What financial resources should be deployed? And really, does the company market size play a role in our choices? During this journey, we are going to hear first from Irene Hoffman, the Secretary of the Genetic Resources Committee for Food and Agriculture, to understand what's at stake and how best to use our resources. Then later, Tiffany Talsma of the Alliance CGIAR will moderate the discussions and lead us through a journey of discovery. At the end of the second roundtable, Immaculada del Pino Alvarez from IDLO will help us think about rule of law implications and considerations and how they can help support the practical implementation of food production systems transformation. It's going to be fascinating, I am absolutely sure. So thank you for inviting me and for inviting us to participate. I'm looking forward to some really rich contributions from colleagues, and I'm sure you do too. So without further ado, I wish you a very great session, and I hand over to Irene Hoffman. Irene, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Louise, and to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. And please allow me to share my screen. Yes, do you see my screen? Okay.
Yes, we do. Yep.
We do. Okay, good. So you have invited me as the Secretary of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which is the only permanent intergovernmental body that specifically addresses all biological diversity for food and agriculture. And as a policy body, it aims to reach international consensus on policies for the sustainable use and conservation of genetic resources for food and agriculture and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their use. The Commission understands biodiversity for food and agriculture as the entire variety of life at the genetic species and ecosystem services that contributes to agriculture and food production in and around production systems. And very important are the genetic resources for food and agriculture, which have been in this conference often summarized under agrobiodiversity. And these are the plant, animal, forest, and aquatic genetic resources, but also the microorganisms and invertebrates that we use in production systems. But under biodiversity for food and agriculture, we also have the wild foods from non-domesticated species, such as capture fisheries, and very importantly, the associated biodiversity, which is all these microorganisms and invertebrates and other organisms that do not end up on our plates, but they provide the very important ecosystem services upon which agriculture depends. And therefore, biodiversity for food and agriculture is absolutely indispensable to food security, sustainable development, and the supply of many vital ecosystem services, and of course, food systems transition. It's both a direct source of nutritious food and the provider of many services that are vital to production. However, as we are all aware, the biodiversity is under threat. And the 2019 Global Assessment Report on the state of the world's biodiversity for food and agriculture has shown that huge numbers of species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades. The ecosystems that are vital to agriculture and food production are being lost and degraded with increasing speed. And what has been also mentioned in this conference, that global agriculture is based on a very narrow range of crop and animal species, and within those species, the genetic diversity is getting lost. Taken together, this means that the resilience of agriculture and food systems is being undermined, and options for producers are narrowing. The drivers that mentioned by the highest number of countries as having negative effects is the change in land and water use and management. And that means that agricultural practices reduce the biodiversity it depends upon. The analysis of the country reports also points to the biodiversity being affected by major global trends such as climate change, international markets, and demography. And then they give rise to direct drivers, as I mentioned, land use change, pollination, or overuse of external inputs, overharvesting, and proliferation of species. The good news, and that's where I'm coming to, is that there are positive trends. The report had shown that there is a wide range of management practices and approaches that are regarded as favorable to sustainable use and conservation for biodiversity for food and agriculture, which is increasing across all kinds of production systems, starting from the plot level to the landscape and ecosystem level. There are more than 20 practices listed in the report that you can look into detail. But what came out is that many of these practices are very location and context specific. They're very knowledge intensive. And often the cause-effect relationship between a practice and the biodiversity outcome is still not clearly identified. And that's a call to the researchers among us to really work on establishing these cause-effect relationships to come up with those solutions that can be applied in specific contexts. As with other global assessment reports that were followed by policy responses, the Commission also in this State of the World report has developed a policy response, which was agreed upon only a few weeks ago. The framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture aims to create a contextual framework for the coherent and consistent implementation of the existing Commission's Global Plan of Action and for the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity for food and agriculture, including the associated biodiversity and wild foods. And in this way, to promote the transition towards more sustainable agri-food systems. It's also, in a broader context, meant to contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the implementation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that the Convention on Biological Diversity is currently developing. And if you ask how the link is going between this global plan of action and the national action, the Commission is also monitoring the implementation of this, its policy responses. And we find that across the sectors, about 60 and 70% of countries have included parts of the global plans of action in their national policies and strategies for the different sectors. We are also following up on the resource side, and there are sectoral reports available that show how things are evolving, and this is a publication that summarized the status in 2020. But I think I showed very much how biodiversity is essential for the transition to food systems, but we are in a policy and business table, so I would like to ask a few questions to the business community. And we have seen that industry leaders for several years now have recognized the risks to their businesses posed by biodiversity loss and environmental damage. Biodiversity loss ranks relatively highly on the global risk report of the World Economic Forum, and industry is taking action. We expect that this action will be even more strongly boosted when we bring the biodiversity and the climate agendas together. But then there is a question, which farms? Who do we target? I think many people take the view that it's very important to target the smallholder farms, which contribute about 84% of the total farms and who have very diverse production systems, who produce 35% of the world food, mostly for local markets. And but they cover only 12% of the total agricultural land. If we look at land, then we should target those 70% of the large farmers, that 1% of farms which are bigger than 50 hectares that farm 70% of the total farmland. And they are integrated into global value chains and therefore reachable through market signals, much more than the smallholder farmers with standards and so on. But I think both need to be addressed, but they have very different demands for research and extension and the support systems that nudge them and guide them into applying sustainable practices. Then we have the consumers. There's a lot of talk about consumers, and I think there's often a concentration on those opportunities where consumers have more preference for fresh and natural and local, regional, seasonal products where biodiversity can come in very strongly, and where government and industry have pushed with more labels, more certification, national promotion of healthy diets and dietary guidelines that include biodiverse foods and so on. But there are challenges. The one is that we still have a vast majority of people who do not have enough to eat and for whom affordable food, cheap food, is very important for their basic survival. But then for the overall picture, we have that people cook less at home, that even what they cook at home is much more governed by convenience food and ready meals. Even in developing countries, we see this concentration of food processing industry and supermarkets. But even though they are rising, these big players, there is still a huge share of the market that is really local market, and where national governments and local communities have a very strong role to play. And then a very critical question is, who pays for the public goods that the market does not pay for? And this is a very tricky one, because we can do a lot through the market, but the conservation of biodiversity for food and agriculture, biodiversity, nature, the custodianship that local and indigenous people have for maintaining this biodiversity is usually not covered by the market. Also, regulating and supporting ecosystem services are in very few cases covered by market prices. And this is in a very intense debate, for example, on subsidies and on access and benefit sharing in different policy fora. But I think there needs to be more thinking about practical applications, how to pay for public good aspects in biodiversity for food and agriculture. And with this, I would like to thank you, and feel free to visit our webpage, and looking forward to the discussions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Irene, and also Louise, for your rousing introduction today. Very exciting to see all of the energy in the room, and also be able to welcome our panelists who are here with us today. We have 4 panelists. Arko Chatterjee, the founder of Natura Yuva, will start us out today with a presentation, followed by Hans Hogevan, the ambassador and independent chairperson of the Council of the FAO. And then a joint presentation from our colleagues, Vivek and Francesca Nunez from IISD, who will be talking at the end, and we'll wrap up with some discussion questions that we've prepared for our panelists today, and also a Q&A session for all of the audience members. So please invite Arko Chatterjee to come forward. He's the founder and CEO of a company called Natura Yuva, which envisions rejuvenating the category of botanicals and natural ingredients for the benefit of consumers, smallholders, and the planet. Arko founded Natura Yuva in 2018 together with his wife Malabika, and he brought to this company more than 15 years of experience in the agribusiness industry, including most recently with Syngenta. So today, Arko will tell us about how creating a vertically integrated system, starting from smallholder farmers, converting them into organic agroforestry farmers, and integrating them into the value chain will help us fight climate change and attain food safety. Welcome, Arko, over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Am I audible, and and can my slides be seen?
Yes, yes to both.
Perfect, thank you. So I thank the organizers of this very important Congress to showcase Natura Yuva to all of you. We heard some pressing questions from Irene in her presentation, some of which intrigued me, pained me immensely. And in trying to search for some of the answers, Natura Yuva was created. I represent 15 colleagues around the world, mostly in India, and close to 30,000 farmers, smallholder farmers, marginal farmers, and tribal farmers who work with us directly. Some of the questions that Irene asked us were, what about the biodiversity questions, and how does the market pay for the natural resources? Well, to start with, the most pressing question that faces us is the inherent threat the category of medicinal and aromatic plants face. And when it comes to my home country, India, there was a survey last decade done by some of the Indian organizations themselves and the government, where 93% of Ayurvedic plants are under some degree of threat, and some under very, very high existential difficulties. Most of it is man-made, And the solution to the problem are, in my view and in our organization's view, the smallholder farmers. And 85% of the farmers, as Irene also showed, are smallholder farmers. So what we basically do is we vertically integrate the smallholder farmers, the processors. We do some processing ourselves and directly connect them to the specific needs of customers, industrial customers, small, big, and large, to solve their problems and their quality issues that they face on a daily basis. They have very high innovation need. They have very high quality needs under increasing regulations, and we believe we could be the solution for it. In this way, we ensure that the local community benefits, the clients whom we serve benefit, as well as our partners with whom we engage. What's our target? By 2035, we envision that 100,000 hectare land, degraded land, be converted to agroforestry farms with high biodiversity. And in the process, 100,000 smallholder farmers' income be doubled. We are planning to conserve 3,500 plant species across the world, mostly in India, and 50 new novel ingredients be launched through them. And of course, we will generate some revenues because we need to get paid. And how do we conserve? So this is a very unique mechanism called ethnomedicinal forest and agroforestry research station. There are a little bit of work going on everywhere in the world, a bit with cocoa in Africa, a bit here, a bit there. And this is nothing new in India. Many smallholder farmers, tribal farmers already do it. But here we are trying to conserve 1,000+ species per ex situ conservation unit, led by ethnobotanists, and bring them into trial cultivation in sync with the local tribal farmers. And in the process, create data, create a lot of scientific literature, and ensure that new novel ingredients benefiting us as consumers come into existence. And yes, there are policy issues that we need to address. So what's really going well here is an increased heightened awareness of biodiversity, thanks to so many movements going on around the world. Also, the COP26 just ended with some degree of focus there, so it's all good. And what goes in our favor is also that the innovation needs of the industry are also very high. Innovation needs from natural ingredients, not its biotech or chemical substitutes. They do more harm to our body than the natural ones. And of course, I mean, natural ingredients are important for us because that's what we need to eat, apply on our skin, and a lot of industrial customers, about $100 billion worth, use it on a daily basis. And so what needs to be different here is, in terms of policy making, is an increased heightened investment capital to pair with the words. And I think the awareness is there, but the forums and the investment platforms should discuss renewable energy at the same level as investment in agriculture, investment in biodiversity to a similar extent, and not just technologies, direct working applications with the farmers. And we also hope that certain regulatory policies in certain countries need to facilitate market access. And I speak of the ABS, the National Biodiversity Policy in India, the organic product policy. There are hordes and hordes of policies and regulators, but still we find contaminations in our products, and that's because of the willful negligence and lack of awareness of the consumers, but also sometimes over-regulation in certain areas where it's not required, and less regulation in areas where we feel it's necessary. So there is a lot of discussion, a lot of awareness that needs to be brought about with the policymakers, and I'm happy to discuss it with the team. So very happy to take your questions, and back to Tiffany. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Arko. And just a note to the audience that you can put your questions in on the Whova platform, and those will be submitted to our moderators, who will collect the questions, and we can go through them together at the end after we've heard from all of our panelists. So if you have a question for Arko, please put it in and let us know that is directed to Arko, so we can channel that along at the end of this session. For now, we'll go ahead with our next presentation from Hans Hogevan. And we invite Hans to come forward on the video. Thank you, Hans. Hans is ambassador and independent chairperson of the Council of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO. He is one of the founding members and current co-chair of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, as well as the Global Action Network for Oceans and Blue Growth. On top of that, Hans has also authored a book on sustainable development, diplomacy, and a number of articles on sustainable development and natural resource policies. So save your very difficult questions for Hans today. His academic posts also include Professor of Practice in Natural Resource Policy at the Fletcher School of Law, as well as Visiting Professor of Sustainable Development Diplomacy at Wageningen University and Research, and lead lecturer in European policy at the Netherlands School for Public Government. So if you haven't heard the word policy enough yet, I think this is the right forum to hear Hans talk to us about how our actions are our future and the work he's doing on getting the private sector more involved in sustainable production and value chains, including agrobiodiversity. Very excited to have you on the panel with us today, Hans. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I should be very much humble now after your introduction. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here with you at the Agrobiodiversity Congress. Our actions are our future. I think we need not more policies, we need more action. All around the world, people are living in poverty and hunger is rising more than we think. Species are being extinct, and also here the numbers are rising at an alarming rate. 3 billion people don't have access to affordable, safe and nutritious food. And 1/3 of our food production is thrown away. So doesn't it not make sense to radically change our current pathway and our food systems? And we have a huge opportunity now as we rebuild our economies and bounce back from the COVID pandemic. This is humanity's big chance. We have 9 seasons left, and we have over 500 million farmers to reach out to. And of course, it seems almost an impossible task, but it can be done. But we need to think out of the box. We need to change our directions, and certainly we need to work closer with the private sector. Of course, we have to use our current instruments much better. For example, accessing the Green Climate Fund and JEF. And there we should push international organizations like FAO and IFAD to support countries in accessing those funds. And of course, we should make much more use of already existing instruments like access and benefit sharing of the Treaty of Plenty and Adequate Resources. And how is it possible that countries still blocking the implementation of that system? But moreover, what we need is working closely together with the private sector and companies, because they are able to change our pathways on the ground. We need massively increase our market infrastructure and also making a more fair price system and fair prices for agro-biodiverse products. We should not think in policy anymore. We have them. We should think in game-changing actions. And I will mention 4 of those. First, we are building a global network of national agri-tech competence centers. Over the last couple of days, we were discussing about the need for new technologies and innovations. But 80% of the needed breakthroughs can be done with the already existing technologies and innovations, but they are not adopted or farmers cannot access them. So we need massively disseminate, scale up and finance the current practices. And that's why a global network of national agri-tech competence centers at national scale are being built to make sure that farmers can access, afford and implement already existing practices so that they can scale up climate smart and agro-biodiverse agriculture. The World Bank and FAO is building a global food loss and waste facility to make sure that we can attract private sector investments on the ground. And they are making first risk financing available so that we get those storage capacities, the new techniques for harvesting done on the ground. And we have been starting now in pilot in Nigeria. So it is showing that it can be done. Thirdly, we are working now, FAO is working with the Rabobank on a global, and the Clinton Foundation on a global framework for carbon credit system for farmers. We already have it for the industry. But think about what we can do if we have a global carbon credit system for farmers, where farmers directly get financial support if they implement climate smart and agro-biodiverse practices. It's underway and can be implemented. And last but not least, let's not forget our youth. Over the last couple of years, youth has been actively involved in our food systems, and we should give them the place they deserve. That's why we can connect food, we can connect youth via food. And the Alliance for the Kitchen, the Global Kitchen Alliance, is connecting the youth via food and recipes. They are teaching schools how to work with recipes which come from different cultures, but are climate neutral and agro-biodiverse. And a cookbook will be launched in the beginning of next year. That could be and are game-changing solutions. And that's what we need. We need to get the action on the ground. Only action can stop our current pathway to disaster. So it's time to stop making excuses and start making changes. We have to act now. Our actions are our future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hans. We have definitely some questions coming in for you already, but we'll save those for later and move first ahead to our colleagues from IISD. We have IISD is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And we have Vivek Vora and Francesca Nunez, who will be giving a joint presentation. Vivek is a senior associate with the Economic Law and Policy Program. He has over 15 years of experience working in sustainable development and currently is supporting the state of sustainability initiatives. Vivek assesses and reports on the characteristics and market performance of voluntary sustainability standards, which is what we're going to hear about today, and how these standards can support sustainable consumption and production. And I'll go ahead and introduce Francesca now so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of their presentation. Francesca Nunez is an economist working with IISD on private investments in sustainable agriculture and forestry, small and medium enterprises, mostly in tropical countries. Francesca has particular expertise in impact investment evaluation and is currently working on certification and its role on smallholder agriculture and forestry investments. Today, Vivek and Francesca will speak to us about de-risking agrobiodiversity investments with voluntary sustainability standards. Welcome to the floor, Francesca and Vivek.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our brief presentation. Before I get into the specifics of the presentation, I'd like to say a few words about the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, and the State of Sustainability Initiatives, or SSI. The IISD is an independent think tank focused on advancing sustainable development globally. The Institute works on a number of areas, including climate change, sustainable resources, and fair economics. The SSI is an initiative focused on advancing sustainable consumption and production via research specifically on voluntary sustainability standards and their potential for advancing sustainability outcomes. For instance, we recently completed reports on how voluntary sustainability standards are currently designed and poised to alleviate poverty and enable investments in sustainable agriculture. Two important topics that that previous speakers touched on already. So, as mentioned by Hans, we need to harness, all facets of society and efforts essentially to shift our agricultural systems towards more sustainable ones. And one area of great potential that is, I would argue, still has to be further tapped is harnessing the power of markets. So voluntary sustainability standards, or VSS, in the agricultural sector are market-based programs that provide incentives for producers to adopt more sustainable practices in exchange for recognition, which allows them to differentiate their products in the marketplace. So some examples of these programs include Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, Global Gap, the Organic Standard. Now, VSS, of course, can support biodiversity in a number of different ways. Most fundamentally, by virtue of requiring the adoption of more sustainable farming practices on the ground, such as integrated pest management, intercropping, agroforestry, and so on, that all of these support agrobiodiversity directly. But they also support the preservation of agrobiodiversity in indirect ways by also requiring farmers to preserve ecosystems biodiversity, such as areas of high conservation value or even threatened species. And then in addition to requiring specific measures to be implemented at the farm level, they also enable, or they've essentially established, helped establish markets for end consumers to support agrobiodiversity. And I think this is extremely important as well. So basically allowing individual buyers through their purchasing decisions to support various sustainable farming efforts, and by virtue of doing so, support agrobiodiversity. And of course, private sector companies have also, in a number of different sectors, have also relied on voluntary sustainability standards to meet their sustainability commitments. So providing them with an opportunity to support agrobiodiversity. Lastly, voluntary sustainability standards have been active in facilitating sustainable investments in agriculture, where they've been leveraged by financial service providers to essentially provide loans and meet their due diligence requirements. But what's most important in the sector is, by virtue of having these programs in place, it has given investors an opportunity to lower their investment risks, because voluntary sustainability standards require farmers to adopt more sound business practices, and also have basically led to the establishment or access for farmers to more lucrative markets. So this diagram shows how various agricultural business risks are linked to financial risks, and most agricultural voluntary sustainability standards have measures that deal with lowering these various risks associated with, let's say, climate change or deforestation, soil health, and those kinds of things. And all of which, all of these risks, of course, have an impact on the bottom line. So it's important to think about these aspects, because it gives us a language essentially to communicate with the private sector on why it's important for them to basically support more sustainable forms of agriculture. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to my colleague Francesca.
Thank you very much. Shall I share my screen? There we go. I'm with you in a second. Here I am. And thank you very much. I'm Francesca Núñez. I will just continue from the presentation that Vivek has started already. And I will go more in depth on the role of voluntary sustainability standards in practice to understand how investors can leverage the voluntary sustainability standards to de-risk investment in agrobiodiversity. Well, this is the an upcoming ISD review that will go into details exactly about how to leverage possibly voluntary sustainability standards to de-risk investment. And the review focuses, of course, on the expertise of ISD team, but also on a specific process that we have carried out to understand how voluntary sustainability standards can help in reducing the risk of investing in agrobiodiversity. First of all, we carried out an expert consultation. And second, we have examined in depth 7 investment cases. For what concerned the expert consultation, it involved 51 investors. And we've been trying to really understand how environmental issues affect the decision of an investor. We also extended the analysis to the social and economic aspects, but to understand how environmental issues are instrumental to the decision of the investors, and how can environmental matters reduce the financial risk of the investment, at the same time contributing to deliver positive impact. We also examined, like I mentioned, 7 investment cases in enterprises that comply with voluntary sustainability standards. Maybe we are more acquainted with the expression certified enterprises, and of course in developing countries. It is worth noticing that 3 of these cases are focused on least developed countries, where we all know that the challenges are important and different from the rest of the world, but also the opportunities to support agrobiodiversity are really important. And if you like more details on the expert consultation, this you can find it on ISD website. And I would like to indeed describe 2 cases of investment in support of agrobiodiversity by leveraging voluntary sustainability standards. These cases are really innovative, I would say, as financial mechanism. And I will mention 2 of them, but all the others are equally valid, and they will be available on the upcoming ISD review on investment in sustainable agriculture and voluntary sustainability standards. The first case is the one of Conservation International Adventures, and the second one is Incofin Investment Manager, that has a specific fund dedicated to invest only on fair trade certified enterprises. Conservation International Ventures is the financial arm of Conservation International. And the case is in Colombia. We all know it's one of the richest biodiversity region of the world. And the production is focused on acai berry and palm heart. So a bit different from the classical cash crops that we all know. It's organic certified. It's a rather long, I would dare say, investment. It's a 5-year loan. And to understand how environmental issues were important in designing this financial product, we know that the interest rate is linked to the environmental performance of the enterprise. It has to comply with a specific program established by Conservation International called Natura Amazonas that has specific requirement on the environmental dimension. So if the enterprise complies with these environmental requirements that support also agrobiodiversity, will pay a 7.25% of interest rates. Otherwise, the interest rate will be higher, up to 9.25%, if the enterprise is not compliant with these environmental requirements. And we can notice that the Natura Amazonas program of Conservation International, it's very much aligned with the thematic of our International Agrobiodiversity Congress. Indeed, Natura Amazonas focus on the generation of knowledge for biodiversity conservation, and it is very much aligned with the scientific symposiums of our Congress that generates knowledge indeed. And Natura Amazonas includes also sustainable production requirements, like the thematic of today's Congress, and it demands also an institutional coordination. And I think we are all looking forward to enhance and strengthen collaboration between, for instance, the local communities that support agrobiodiversity and the institutions that provides enabling environment, just to appeal to the policy side of this forum. To conclude with Conservation International Ventures, they also underlined in their investment the importance of VSS in increasing trust and transparency in the activities, but also among the participants, on top of course, mitigating commercial, operational, and financial risk. The second case is the one of Incofin, their Fair Trade Access Fund. It's focused on DRC Congo, that we know being the second biggest tropical rainforest of the world, on coffee that is double certified fair trade and organic. To see again how environmental issues were important in the design of this financial product. The credit facility is backed up by a sale contract, which means there is a buyer willing to declare that they will buy the produce from this enterprise. And this acts as a collateral, as a form of guarantee for the investor. So basically, the fact of complying with voluntary sustainability standards help the producer to attract both buyers and investors. So we see this triangle. We have the farmers, we have the buyers, we have the investors, and we have the voluntary sustainability standards that act as intermediaries between these actors, that's facilitating access to finance, also for enterprise that often don't have hard collaterals. To conclude, voluntary sustainability standards can reduce what is financially material business risk, and increase trust and transparency, and at the same time facilitate access to markets, thus supporting investment in agrobiodiversity initiatives. Can create sustainable business cases, because we need to create them. There aren't many cases that at the same time deliver positive social, economic, and environmental outcomes. What's next for voluntary sustainability standard to support agrobiodiversity? First of all, design established investment products that are designed for voluntary sustainability standards compliant producers, like those that I described. Promote, business relationship to catalyze investments, and create favorable investment conditions in VSS compliant production. And the upcoming ISD review goes very much into details in recommendations for governments, sustainability standard schemes, investors, and so forth. And here I just presented very few of these recommendations, and also to think a bit out of the box. Sustainability standards could also help for complying with the new regulation established by the EU about sustainable finance disclosure, and also support the work of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, which we believe can create this enabling environment to support agrobiodiversity. So please stay tuned with the upcoming review of ISD. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Francesca. We will now move to some questions that we've prepared. And I please encourage those of you who are watching to also use this opportunity to put your own questions in, and make a note if they are targeting any specific speakers, or if you don't say, then we get to decide who has the opportunity to answer. We would like to dig a little bit deeper on this question of how policy instruments can be leveraged to encourage the private sector to transition to more sustainable agrobiodiverse production systems. And we would like to first invite specific panelists to share their thoughts on some questions that we've prepared today. So the first question is, what are the most pressing changes that you think are needed in policy to increase the use of agrobiodiversity? Arko, if I can pick on you first, since you've had the most time to recover since your intervention, I would love to hear your thoughts, especially as coming from the perspective of an entrepreneur who really needs policy to work in your favor. How would you see that?
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. It's a very important question, and in terms of our business requirement, I think one of the primary bottleneck that faces us in bringing innovation and the benefits of agrobiodiversity is bringing new products to the market. The industry wants new products, be it cosmetics, nutraceuticals, food, flavors, even pharmaceutical. But sometimes the regulatory aspect, comes in the way, especially in the country of India. That is really something that needs a very close look. The policy is there, but the implementation is rather difficult. The second area of policy is around availability of and promotion of organic seeds and starter materials. Well, it's easy to speak about lack of biodiversity and so on, but the ground reality is that even if you want to implement the policies of the governments, not necessarily supports the proliferation, the multiplication of organic seeds in a high quality environment. So I think there is a need to look very, very closely and deeply into the policies.
Great. I think that's a really interesting proposition, certainly in terms of availability of planting material and also making it an attractive choice. Hans, you mentioned earlier that you don't think we need policies as much as we need action. Could you say a bit more about whether you see a role for policy or regulations in actually catalyzing that action or accelerating it? And what would that look like? You're on mute still.
The reason why I'm saying we don't need policies, because we have all the policies. I think with Agenda 2030, the SDGs, the work, for example, what FAO and the Committee on Genetic Resources, the treaty is doing, we have the instruments. The question is how to implement, and there we focus too much only on governments, and I would say regulatory systems of governments. We have to reach out to the private sector, and not to the private sector just give funding to funds, but sit together with the private sector to see how we can create investment opportunities for companies. And for example, what we are doing in Nigeria, for example, with Olam on tomatoes, we see that almost half of the tomato production is lost because of storage capacity and packaging material. What we do there in Nigeria is to sit together with the government as well as Olam now, to see what the government can do, for example, helping with infrastructure, and what then Olam can invest, not funded by anybody, but their own investments in creating that storage capacity or help supporting better packaging material. And often you have to overcome the first risk for companies. And that's where the World Bank is now stepping in to give that first risk, I would say not financing, but making sure that there is an insurance scheme to overcome this problem. And it's the same with, I think, with organic material. I've seen many seed companies are willing to step up and start creating a market for organic products. But you have to go do a couple of things. Make sure that the farmers have the capacity and the access to those new seeds, but then also build the value chain and the marketing of those products so that the consumer will make a choice for those products. And then you always have to look to the price difference, but it can be narrowed down if you work together with the different actors in the value chain. And I think that's why we have to sit together with the private sector and just not continue making more policies, because we have so many policies and we have not enough investments by the private sector. And even bigger investment schemes, bigger investors are now looking to the food systems as a high priority investment possibility, and that's there now to grab.
Great, thank you. And that's a perfect segue into a question I had in mind for Francesca, which is, Beyond policy, Francesca, based on your research, could you tell us more about what you think are the most important enabling structures and processes that are needed to facilitate the transition to biodiverse food systems?
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting question, Tiffany, and it gives me the chance to bring some of my favorite issues. Going beyond policy, but also related, of course, to it, I would say that the transition to biodiverse production system certainly requires finance. Farmers to adopt more sustainable practice need finance, and we need both public and private finance. I would say that public finance really would be there to provide an enabling environment to attract also private capital. Ideally, there could be incentives for farmers to adopt practices that support agrobiodiversity, that enhance agrobiodiversity. For instance, guarantee provided to farmers that intend to transition to sustainable agricultural practices. And also, of course, we need at the same time private capital to fill in the gap. But as we all know, investment in agriculture and agrobiodiversity practices are deemed rather risky. So we need an approach to reduce the risk, this financial risk. And this is a way maybe through the very same sustainable agricultural practices to reduce the risk and mobilize private capital, hopefully. Thank you. I hope that answered your question.
Great. No, it's perfect. I think that's a very complementary topic also to what Hans was discussing. And Vivek, I was really inspired by your enthusiasm for the potential for voluntary sustainability standards. And what we see is that in climate action, for sure, civil action is increasing as many become disillusioned by government intervention for climate action. How effective do you see policies in driving transformational change in food production to address environmental concerns?
Thank you for the question, Tiffany. Well, I definitely see the parallels between what's happening in the climate change sphere and biodiversity, for instance, and also kind of the need to shift our food production systems. Because at the end of the day, all these things are all interconnected, of course. And I think one of the things that is going to help us, unfortunately, in a way, make this shift is a global population that is realizing, for better or for worse, through personal experiences, all these different kind of important shocks and stresses that we're going to increasingly face with climate change as we, as what is being projected. So if you take a look at the news today, it's covered with, wildfires and floods in various parts of the world. And I think that's basically creating a kind of collective consciousness around, how the world is changing and how we need to think differently. So I think that personally, I think there is an opportunity specifically within the marketplace to create kind of a customer base that is sensitive to the difficulties we're likely going to change. And of course, that also includes the need to change food production systems. But in order to do that within the context or within the current system that we're in, we need to create that customer base that is looking for supporting agricultural products that are more sustainably grown, that take us away from the brink of the impacts of climate change and those kinds of things. So because as I mentioned, we are facing increasing disturbances across the world in various ways. I think that there is an opportunity to create kind of a market, a market and an interesting customer base around the needs to make these shifts and to basically offer this customer base with products that enable us to make this shift towards more sustainable production. And of course, voluntary sustainability standards can play a role in that, but it's not the only mechanism.
Great, thank you. Just moving along a little bit, we have, I think, about 2 more questions, and then we'll move to some questions from the audience, which are pouring in. So maybe we even wrap up our own planned questions a bit early, because these are some good ones that are coming in. Thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions there. So maybe one last question before we open it up to the audience. And this one, I'll just put it to the room and let someone raise their hand who wants to answer. But one might argue that industrial agriculture focuses on efficiency over resilience. And we see that in these different agroforestry or modified commercial agriculture systems. And we want to know, what do you see as the game changers in shifting the mindset of agribusiness towards more sustainable production? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump right in. We don't need to be too formal about it.
Well, I can jump in because I'm from the agribusiness side. So I think the game changer in our view that can shift the mindset is awareness and price. And in terms of awareness, we need to convey that sustainable regenerative agricultural systems are good for everyone. It's good for humans. It's good for the soil. It's good for the animals, and so on. And this is actually could be much. The input cost can be much cheaper than mechanized farming going forward. And there are ways, there are technologies available to be deployed in such farms, as you see in my background. Although it seems very impossible, but it actually, there are enough technology available today that can actually bring the costs down. So if you can make the organic sustainable produce price competitive to the consumers, I think it'll draw valid attention and investments as well going forward. So that's my belief.
Thank you. Hans, you do politely have your hand up. Over to you.
Yes, I already mentioned, I think I agree with what was said by Arko, but we have to be very careful. Our food systems start with our farmers. And we have about 500 million farmers to reach to. I think we have the technologies, but how do we get those technologies to the farmers? Even if you have more resilient technologies for farmers, how can they access it and how can they finance it? And I think that's why I mentioned the first game-changing initiative, which is now underway, is the national centers. But I think especially, and it's working, what we have seen now when into the climate change arena, what is working in industry is the carbon credit system. And now with FVO and Rabobank and Clinton Foundation, we're trying to build a carbon credit system for farmers. And for those farmers which implement, I would say, climate smart agriculture or biodiversity smart practices, if they get a direct financing, that will be the stimulus for farmers to produce in that manner. And then, of course, you have to sit together with the value chain partners to make sure that they get a fair price for what they are producing, and that not the profits will go to the end part of the value chain, but also the profits will go to the farmers. And that's at least a game changer in the making.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Francesca or Vivek, do you want to chime in, or should we jump to the audience questions?
We can go to the audience question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will just go in order of how the questions came in. So this is not any prioritization because I can't do that on the fly right now. This is a question for Arko. What are the primary benefits for smallholder farmers that adopt polyculture versus monoculture?
Well, the benefits are enormous. They get to have earnings throughout the year rather than any bi-seasonal harvest. The second is the input costs go down actually as time progresses. If they're able to have a natural input system developed in the farm, this goes down. The third is the soil on which it actually relies on. It improves in its carbon content. Going back to what Hans was mentioning on carbon credit, the soil can act as a carbon sink. It's linked to the microorganisms. It's linked to the high humus and the high carbon content in the soil, and its power to absorb more atmospheric carbon. It can provide food for animals and food for other organisms who are dependent on the farm. So it's not just human beings, as Irene said right in the beginning, but also other living organisms that need to sustain. So I can go on and on. The list is enormous. So, but I think I will leave it at these 4 or 5 key benefits.
Perfect. Thank you. And this question doesn't look like it has anybody to, it's not tagged to anyone. So many certification systems are too expensive for small scale producers. What is being done to make them more inclusive? I guess maybe Vivek or Francesca, you'd like to take that, but I'll leave it open to the room.
Sure, I'd be glad to jump in on that question. Well, there's a number of different strategies, I guess, or approaches that volunteer sustainability standards are adopting to try and make their programs more inclusive. One of which is developing standards that are specific to smallholders, so making those standards more accessible. For instance, there are some standards that are actually establishing specific funding mechanisms for smallholders to access to pay for those, initial certification costs associated with becoming standard compliant and transitioning their farms towards more sustainable farming practices. So that's another strategy that is being used. I mean, the challenges are real. They're not. It is a very good question because the standards are viewed in some ways, in certain contexts, as barriers to markets, or especially smallholders have less resources. So it is a real problem. In other sectors, I know that there's some standards have basically been able to work with, let's say, a development agency. So the development agency would then go in and help with building capacity of smallholders. So then they could then access or adopt the standard and then access markets. So there's a number of different strategies that standards have adopted. And I would say probably for the most part, at least what I've seen in the last 10 years, is the development of standards specific to smallholders has become almost a new normal within voluntary sustainability standards operating in the agricultural sector. So that's my answer to the question.
That's great. Thank you. These are great questions. These are already giving me all the material I need for my summary session later today. So thank you also for making my job a bit easier. Okay, let's see. It looks like the next question is also open. The adoption of sustainable agroforestry at scale takes time, but investors work on shorter time scales. How do you balance this? Should I pick on someone, or does someone want to jump in?
I can
Go
take
ahead.
that, maybe, if there is nobody else that wants to say something. Yes, I'm glad for the participant that asked that. It's a very thorny question, and this is what we have been trying to investigate deeply, how to encourage more long-term investment. Indeed, the benefits are enormous because they allow farmers to plan, invest in their own activities and be more profitable. So this is the thesis we are carrying forward with the investors. If you invest in the long term, you create the conditions for the farmers to be more profitable and create also at the same time positive social and environmental impact. So the long-term finance creates the good business case in which to invest. And we also have the evidence from investors that those, maybe not many, but there are investors that work with long-term horizon, like the case, for instance, that I have presented with Conservation International Ventures. They had a 5 years contract, which is maybe not very long for a tree to grow, but still it's much better than a 1 year or 3 year contract. So it is a difficult point, but we have the evidence and we have a good point to build on to encourage investors to invest in the long term. Thank you very much.
Yeah, perhaps Tiffany, I can jump in as well. I think here, and I very much agree with what was said by Francesca, but here you have to bridge or to match, I would say, the need for long-term investments and direct business opportunities also for farmers. And I think there the banking sector can play a crucial role. I've seen in 2 cases where the banking sector could give a loan to a company who's working now on Agrobiodiversity. So, and probably the profits will come in about 4 or 5 years. But making sure that there is already a contract where he gets profits already for the next 2 years, then he's assured that also the investment of the farmers, not only the investment of investors, can get the profits on the longer term. But the banking sectors, and it's certainly not only the public bank, but also the private banks has to come in. And I know that also private banks, because of the changing demands of the public, is looking for much more business opportunities in the agroforestry sector. Thank you.
Sounds very promising. Thank you. Okay, moving on. We have a comment on, again for Arko, great intervention from Arko Chatterjee. What do you see as the most urgent policy changes to enhance adoption of neglected and underutilized species, in your view?
Well, policy on conservation and access and benefit sharing. As a policy and also for protecting the investors' money, it's better to transfer the benefits directly by us, the commercial organization, to the farmers and the tribal community directly than give it to a local government. We are happy to do as well. We're happy to do both, but it does appear that the regulatory aspect there needs to be fine-tuned, at least in the country of India, where we are actually there's an urgent need to look at it. But yes, the policy exists, but it's the implementation and it's fine-tuning, allowing us to directly give the benefits to the local community would be more beneficial than handing over the benefits to a government organization, and we don't know what happens with that money later on. So it's transparency is also a key. There is also a need for government to reveal what are they doing with this pot of money that they are getting from commercial organizations. That will really accelerate and untangle the huge potential and wealth that exists to be brought to the tribal and local farming communities, but also to consumers who need new, innovative, high quality products to be eaten, to be put on our skin, etc., etc.
And can I jump in, Tiffany, as well? Because I think Arko mentioned a crucial element, and that's the access and benefit sharing part. And I think we have 2 instruments available in the treaty, the access and benefit sharing, and in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the governments are bogged down in the negotiations. And I already apologize for using some strong wording, but somebody has to kick some asses to make sure that there is a breakthrough in those negotiations. And I know there are difficult issues, but why wait till everything is solved and not using already for now, when we don't have perhaps a perfect system, but we need a system to get that access and benefit sharing to the farmers. And there we need really political pressure, and there's pressure also from the private sector and pressure also from the public, but we need to kick some asses. Thank you. Sorry for the strong wording.
Brilliant. Thank you. I like the the fact that we're having also a more dynamic discussion. So please do jump in and bring your strong words or however it needs to be said. Very good. I think we are reaching the end of our time, so I do need to prioritize some of the questions a little bit. Apologies if I've skipped an important one. We have a question from Gabriela. She says, very interesting interventions, thank you. Going beyond VSS and the business as usual, what other ways can we see the private sector, especially the larger corporations, engage in the transition towards more sustainable agriculture systems? And how do we see the synergy between scientific and research sectors and the private sectors to be strengthened in order to measure impact more thoroughly? So there's a lot in there, but just to summarize two pieces. One is, how can we go beyond business as usual to have stronger commitment from big business? And what's the role of science and research in strengthening their accountability and the measurement there? Does anyone feel particularly strongly about this one?
I was just going to share a quick thought on the question. I think that it's the question is spot on in the sense that there's a number of things, of course, that the private sector can do. They have a lot of resources and so on and so forth. They're driven by different. They're driven by a priority of making profit, of course, but one thing that I think is needed is for the private sector to engage with the with the farmers, with the producers, with the folks who are actually producing their raw materials, and not just engage with them, engage with the farmers themselves, but also their contexts. So what I see is private sector companies having a role in terms of engaging with their supply chain, of course, which includes farmers, but also engaging with the actual locality of where their raw materials are coming from. And so there's this engagement of stakeholders within kind of farming landscapes that support this production of raw materials with the actual supply chain stakeholders. It's kind of like a vertical governance that needs to happen along the supply chain for sustainability, and a horizontal governance. And those two kind of axes, if you will, need to come together in some fashion. And I think that the private sector can have an important role in making that happen. So kind of speaks to what Hans was sharing with us earlier.
Absolutely. And
perhaps coming to the bigger companies, what you see, of course, now is look to the shareholders. The shareholders want to see certainly the multinationals to become much more sustainable, not in their own products, but also in their suppliers. And I know that instruments, and I know, for example, in the seed sector, an instrument is developed to rank seed sector companies in their sustainability. And if you make that publicly, you know that you get an enormous pressure from shareholders to change, I would say, the direction of that kind of the companies. And I think that's thinking out of the box, but using also the pressure of shareholders to change the direction of multinationals. And then, of course, with the multinationals, other will follow.
Great. This is a wonderful transition, actually, to the next question, which also brings in the aspect of remote locations and sectors. So agrobiodiversity exists in more remote and marginal farming systems in general, but private sector in general are not interested in remote locations and regions. Public sectors are also not seen as given adequate attention to marginal areas. So how can we provide strategies and incentives to make actions in those remote locations, those harder to reach places, more feasible? Francesca, could you take that one based on?
Thank you very much. It's absolutely a very good question, and the most challenging areas are indeed those in remote rural areas where there is hardly any offer of good sustainable business cases, and let alone about investors wanting to go there and do any business. But indeed, this is what we've been trying again to analyze, focusing really on least developed countries to see what the conditions are and what are the incentives that we could produce to farmer intervention in these very remote locations. And certainly the practice to promote its collaboration with the local governments, being able to provide easier access to inputs and seeds capital, possibly guarantee. So there is really a combination of, it's a co-work, it's a collaboration within the local governments, and possibly the intervention of a development agency then can facilitate the aggregation of the farmers, of the producers of remote local areas, that creating a bigger scale, a bigger size for the enterprise, then can attract more private actors, given also this support to the context that also Vivek was mentioning, which is very important. So a company that look after also the context in collaboration possibly with local governments and development agency, we can create the condition that favor the works also in remote areas. Thank you.
Thank you. It seems we only have 3 minutes left. So this will be our last question, unfortunately, and really need to reiterate, these questions have been great. It is possible to carry on the Q&A in the Whova chat room, so please feel free to reach out to the panelists, and panelists, please check your Whova account to be able to continue some of these conversations on there. Last question, what role do you see for participatory guarantee systems or other forms of farmer-to-farmer or network-based certification for increasing the number of farms with agrobiodiverse practice?
If I may, I think they're excessively important, actually. These smaller scale, ground up efforts to network and coalesce either as farming cooperatives or other structures are really important. So the role of participatory guarantee systems, for instance, is a really good example of almost like a bottom-up approach to certification or voluntary sustainability standards. Very important, and it's also a means to develop kind of a local market oriented towards more agrobiodiverse friendly products. So I think that, and so we need to tackle this problem at various scales. And voluntary sustainability standards that have kind of an international scope have a role, and then the small scale efforts also have a very important role as well. So yeah, I think it's very important.
Great.
Perhaps I can jump in this. I could refer back. I think I very much agree with what's said by Vivek, because I think those small scale, I would say, cooperatives or groups of farmers, if they produce in a more agro-biodiverse or sustainable way, I think they should be supported with easier access by the banking system, so that they have an easier access to loans of the banks. And I know that some of the private banks are thinking in that manner, and their governments can push and help those banks to take this step to finance those cooperatives as an example. And then, of course, you will influence also the value chain in the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's all that we have the time for on this platform, but the conversation continues online, and please feel free to reach out to answer some of the questions that are posted on there. They are available to everyone who's participated in the session and who's registered for the event. We're moving now to a roundtable where we're going to hear from more business sector actors on their perspectives on the role for research and science-based innovation to support biodiversity in industry and the challenges to businesses to take that up. So encourage you to stay on for that session. And of course, ask your challenging questions and feel free to pop into the discussion over there as well. And then we'll be wrapping up after that our session for the day. With an address from Immaculada from IDLO on the legal aspects of what we've been discussing today. So still a lot of perspectives. And thank you very much for joining us today, to all of the panelists. It was wonderful to hear from you.
The Amazon is the most biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem on our planet. Its vastness, density, and beauty are breathtaking. Besides the ocean, it is one of the largest CO2 reservoirs in the world and stores 20% of all fresh water. But the Amazon is threatened by the needs of a growing population. Forests disappear to produce minerals, food, and fuel. Earlier this year, researchers calculated that the Amazon is now more likely to contribute to rather than mitigate climate change, because it will store fewer greenhouse gases than it emits. And that is mostly due to massive deforestation. Yet, there are ways to meet human needs by planting trees instead of cutting them down. This is what Camino Verde has been doing for over a decade, because we know the Amazon can be restored. We are a nonprofit organization based in the Peruvian Amazon. In the last 15 years, we have created nurseries and planted diverse polyculture agroforestry systems. Our regenerative mission has led us to plant over 100,000 trees, reforest 100 hectares of rainforest, and protect 100 hectares of primary forest, the source of our seeds. On what used to be degraded land, trees now grow that provide us with food, timber, and medicine, while mimicking a natural forest. We planted trees that serve both nature and humans, and on our regenerative farms grow more than 400 different species. Let us introduce you to a few of them, starting with our favorite fruits. We grow coconut palms and citrus trees such as lemon and orange and a variety of different types of bananas. But especially, we grow species you might never have heard of. These include copoaçu. Copoaçu is a relative of cacao. It has a sour and aromatic pulp. The seeds can be used to make chocolate. Pihuayo, probably our favorite of all, is a palm fruit that tastes like an oily potato. Eaten with a bit of salt, it's just heaven. Umari looks like a mango, but it's harder to peel. It has only little pulp, but it tastes like the most aromatic avocado you've ever eaten. Zapote is a lot richer in pulp. It tastes like a mix of bananas, squash, and even melon. Besides fruits, we grow medicinal species used traditionally to heal all sorts of conditions. Have you ever heard of sangre de grado, the dragon blood tree that produces a red sap incredibly effective at healing wounds and ulcers? Or maybe copaiba, a tree whose trunk is filled with an oleo resin that is said to be antiseptic, analgesic, and more. The pulp of pate fruit can be boiled down to a syrup used against coughs and pulmonary infections. There is a variety of ways to process medicinal plants. You can put the bark in alcohol to create medicinal extracts, or take a tea by drying up the leaves. But even more interestingly, an important activity here at the farm is distillation. One of the main species we distill is Brazilian rosewood. In the 20th century, rosewood was cut down for European perfumery, fueled in part by the success of Chanel No. 5, until it was nearly extinct.
Every woman alive wants Chanel No. 5. So give her Chanel No. 5 in the classic bottle.
After a 5-year search for seeds, Camino Verde was able to plant the first rosewood trees in 2013. A sustainable method was developed to extract rosewood essential oil without destroying the plant. Today, we are growing our impact by planting trees with local farmers and native communities. In 2021 alone, we planted trees with 116 families. Rosewood essential oil is in demand on the international market at a high price point. This allows the farmers we work with to generate a steady source of.
Wonderful. Welcome everyone to the second roundtable of our Production Day Policy and Business Forum. If you've stuck with us from the first half of this session, you heard from policy and business as they talked about the role of policy to encourage private sector to move towards agrobiodiverse systems. And we are now moving to hear the perspective of others who work more in research and with the private sector to hear about the role for research and science-based innovation in driving private sector and enabling private sector to take up agrobiodiverse systems. On our panel today, we have a wonderful mix from both banking, research for industry, and also pre-competitive business associations. So we'll have a lot of perspectives for you today. We have first 5 to 7 minute presentations from each of our panelists, and then we'll move into a Q&A session with questions that I'm dying to ask, and then we'll move into a Q&A session with questions from the audience. So as you're listening, please feel free to start putting those in to the chat box. First of our panelists that we're going to hear from today is Emma van de Ven from Rabobank. She's one of the co-founders of Acorn, which is a Rabobank initiative that she will be presenting to you about today. And she's responsible for strategy and research to ensure the long-term success of the proposition. Emma's mission is to create a balance between commercial success and ideological optimism. And she focuses on developing new business models that create a healthier world and a better place for the people on it, including the large number of smallholders that Rabobank works with. Welcome to the floor, Emma. I'll hand over to you now.
Hi, Tiffany. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me. So, like you already mentioned in the bio, I work for Rabobank. Rabobank is a large Dutch bank, the second largest in the Netherlands, but worldwide, Rabobank really specializes in agriculture. So food and ag is really the core business. Rabobank is really active in that respect. And from that position, we've been looking from the innovation team, how can we use our position as a bank to create, like I said, the better world that Rabobank is looking for. So the way we've approached that with Acorn, which is the name of the project, is through the carbon market as the first payments for ecosystem service market that we see can help large projects, but still hasn't been beneficial for smallholder farmers, whereas smallholder farmers are at the same time the group of people that is very intensely impacted by climate change. So where the carbon market tries to reinstate the balance between emitters and offsetters of carbon, these smallholder farmers are often excluded. So for Acorn, it's the mission to take away the barriers for smallholder farmers. And we've seen 3 major barriers. First of all, it is really intense practice to measure carbon sequestered. For these smallholder farmers, it's nearly impossible to do that themselves. And so therefore we've developed remote sensing solutions to really measure how much carbon is sequestered on their land on a year-on-year basis. So really an ex-post measurement. And that obviously focuses on above ground biomass due to the spectral component of remote sensing. So really focusing on agroforestry systems, smaller farmers who've adopted more regenerative, biodiverse as well, agroforestry practices that you can see from space. So that's the first thing Acorn does is take away the barrier of measurement through remote sensing. The second thing is take away the barrier of the high certification costs. And you see that in order for a project to get certified, that can cost between 10,000 to 30,000 euros. And that is a lot, assuming smallholder farmers in the project, even if they congregate in, let's say, cooperative or even NGO driven. And that's a large barrier. So for that, we've developed a full framework that has been approved and certified by Plan Vivo, which is a great carbon standard that really specializes in smallholder farmers and nature-based solutions. So with that framework and the matching methodology, we've taken the barrier of the high costs of access to certification away. And the third is really using our position as a bank to match these groups of smallholder farmers to potential buyers of carbon removal units, as we call them. So really enabling the market mechanism and moving towards, through the data-driven approach of measuring carbon sequestered, a tradable carbon credit where we can match the farmers with the buyers of it and ensure that the farmers are adequately compensated for their payments for ecosystem services. Now, that's the starting point for Acorn in the carbon market, but we really want to move towards enabling much more compensation for these farmers for all the ecosystem services they offer, and not just carbon sequestration. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. We'll have questions for you at the end of the session, but first we'd like to move ahead with the other three panelists. Next on our list is Clea Kaskakuk. Clea is Director for Policy and Advocacy of Food and Nature at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD. In her role, she leads advocacy and policy development for WBCSD members in food and nature, and also drives collective action toward key global summits, such as the UN Food Systems Summit. She previously worked for 12 years at Cargill in the areas of corporate responsibility, sustainability, policy, and communication. So she's definitely not new to the job, and is a Harvard Kennedy School graduate with a master's in public policy. Today, Clea will tell us about her work at the WBCSD, driving joint collaborations between science and business sectors. So exactly what we're here to learn about. And also particular strategies such as science to policy dialogues. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Clea.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you for the kind and detailed introduction. I was preparing for this and I was thinking, okay, let's see how much context I need to give, but you already gave a lot. So I won't go too much into who I am. What I should mention is that WBCSD is a global CEO-led organization of over 200 companies working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. And we do want to make our members more successful and sustainable by focusing on the maximum positive impact for shareholders, society, and the environment. That is just from a general context. What we have seen is that it's becoming increasingly important for companies and business to be working together on a pre-competitive basis to address issues that they're facing in their own companies, in their supply chains, and beyond, and that they cannot address alone, but they want to work on it together. So it's business coming together, but also not working in a vacuum. And their collaboration with others, and often just having a discussion, is becoming incredibly and exceedingly important. So what we have been doing, we have been reaching out, and also the scientific community has been reaching out to us more and more, and us doing the same, just to discuss issues, have conversations, etc. The Food System Summit that Tiffany already referenced became a starting point or a key milestone event that we focused on as we were working at WBCSD and saying, okay, what do we need from a business perspective and from a business community in order to achieve food systems transformation? There is a lot of work that we're doing around standards, around targets, around building coalitions, but what needs to happen to address some of these challenges? And really, are we well enough equipped on our own to do this? Right? We should engage in dialogue. So we created this concept of a science to policy dialogue, and I will be happy to share the links later in the chat, where we brought together leaders from business, leaders from the scientific community, and civil society together through a 6-month process, reviewing a background research paper that we wrote, a Delphi process that was handled anonymously, but where all the participants could provide input, and then 3 days of structured and organized dialogue to address fundamental issues with regards to food systems transformation. And just to give a brief example, I was going through the list earlier on companies that participated. It were companies like Bayer, Olam, PepsiCo, Corteva, Unilever, Nestle, OCP, but also civil society organizations and research organizations such as the UN Food Systems Summit Secretariat, the World Bank, OECD. We had CIAT participate, Wageningen University in a previous run, MIT. So really, and I can list many, many more. Diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, and expertise were incredibly important. And what we looked at is we've done 2 of these. And some of the outcomes on the production and equity that I would like to focus on, and I know I want to keep this also quite brief and then answer particular questions later on, it was really around the need for greater alignment around science and agreement on definitions and how to move forward. So on the science to policy dialogue that we worked on, we issued some key recommendations. And oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this. We also had farmers and farmer groups, so the World Farmers Organizations, but also a representative from the Jamaican Rural Women's Association joined this process. But for example, we set concrete recommendations around creating a common set of global targets for food systems, redesigning policy development platforms using inclusive multi-stakeholder processes with objectives anchored in a joint global scientific agenda, and also shift finance and harness digitalization to better account for and address risks and opportunities. And we also looked at key enablers, such as building and maintaining trust and buy-in, investing in livelihoods and communities, and prioritizing equity. The equity discussion is becoming increasingly important. So anyway, we put all this together. We issued the chapter. I have a summary report on it too. We published this as part of our food and agriculture roadmap, have shared it in multiple discussions. But the way I want to finish around this, I think the real power in the science to policy dialogue process, which we've done now 2 times, took 6 months each time, was the way to get there, and the relationships that we built or helped build during the pandemic in a virtual setting, and the trust between people that traditionally might not have had these conversations. We had civil society, we had business, we had academia coming together. We tried to be as global as possible, as diverse as possible, and really build virtual friendships. And I know we're dealing with complex issues, but it is so incredibly important to bring the business community sometimes to also listen and learn on some of these other challenges, provide their perspective, and also see how business can implement on the ground and actually make some of, let's say, the scientific recommendations reality. So I was at COP26 last week. It seems like so much longer ago, and actually met people who had participated or acted as critical friends in the SPD. And that was really, really powerful. With that, I'm done. I'm happy to share more of the links, work around resilience, etc. But just wanted to share a specific example of what can be done, the outcomes, and why it turned out to be powerful.
Great, Clea. That's really exciting. And thank you very much for coming to share your experience working on that multi-stakeholder platform with us today. That's a very unique perspective. Next, we'll be going over to my colleague, Dr. Marcela Quintero, who also works for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. Marcela is the director of the research director of the Multifunctional Landscapes Research Area. She's an ecologist by training and holds a PhD from the Department of Agronomy at University of Florida. With over 20 years of experience, Marcela's core work has been focused on research project implementation, especially around watershed management, payments for ecosystem services, environmental impacts in agricultural landscapes, and the adoption determinants of sustainable land use-based options. Marcela will talk with us today about her recent work in these areas together with government, business, and development sector partners. Welcome, Marcela. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And today, and thanks also for the introduction. And today, what I want to talk about very briefly is from the perspective of research and from the perspective of science, how we are seeing this interface between research and business. and private sector engagement. And here I just want to share with you some thoughts that we have been kind of brainstorming inside my team that is about helping to produce innovations that can deliver multifunctional landscapes, including increasing the biodiversity in landscapes and then the benefits derived from that. So, and here I want to start by saying, hold on, I'm going to share something with you.
Okay,
Hold
seems
on,
that you're back. We lost you for just a minute, Marcela. Are you back? Do you hear us? Okay, it seems that the internet in Cali, Colombia is not cooperating. I wonder, Anirudh, would it be okay for you if I could introduce you? Are you ready to go? And then we can jump back to Marcela.
Sounds good to me.
Fabulous. Thank you for your flexibility. Great. We have Dr. Anirudh Badam, who is Principal Research Manager at Microsoft Research. Microsoft Research conducts research for industry included in data-driven agriculture, which I'm personally very excited to hear about the work you've been doing in that area recently. At Microsoft Research, Anirudh leads cutting-edge cloud and connectivity projects. I was looking at his profile and understood very little of what I was reading, so I've truncated it to the words that I can actually say. It was very much computer science background. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, Anirudh, and that I can relate to is the Internet of Things-based digital agriculture solution that you've been working on most recently called FarmBeats. And congratulations on the award that you won recently for your publication in that regard. Of course, you're welcome to explain to us in plain English what the other things are that you're working on. But we're very excited to hear also about your experience in developing research for industry and shipping that research into commercially viable products. I think that type of research for impact is very exciting. And so the floor is all yours to share with us about that today. Welcome.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'm excited to be here too. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Hey folks, thanks for the introduction, Tiffany. I'm going to talk about technology for sustainable agriculture. This is part of the FarmBeats initiative that Tiffany introduced earlier. So agriculture, food production, climate change, they're all related. So we've been working on technologies for tackling this. Significant portion of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. Food production accounts for 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, including transportation. And the longer growing seasons is different part of the world. It complicates the problem. But at the same time, soil also holds 80% of the terrestrial carbon, which means there's an incredible opportunity, not just from a carbon source perspective, but also from a sink perspective. So as you know, carbon can be both, agriculture can be both a source and sink of carbon. We all know the processes that trap carbon dioxide both above the soil and below the soil. And at the same time, we also know about how agriculture is a source of carbon dioxide and methane and other emissions. So if we have to go and reduce these emissions, then we need to have really good measurement techniques. Where do we invest in terms of measurement, mitigation, and reductions, right? And for that, the first thing that we need is connectivity within the farm, right? All the way from sensors and automating that data capture. Where are the emissions coming from? Where can you be more precise in terms of applying fertilizer, perhaps more effectively, not as a blanket application of fertilizer, but only where it's needed? How do we do that? That requires a different way of sensing than what we are doing today. The other one is estimating what the practices are today. How are you tilling your farms? When are you harvesting them? What kind of equipment are you using? What's the carbon footprint of each of these things? And the other one is, once you've identified all of these agricultural practices, how do you put a carbon number on it? How do you convert the fact that, okay, this is the kind of tilling method that you've used, this is the kind of harvesting that you've used, this is the kind of crops that you've grown. How do you convert all of these practices that you've followed into a carbon number? Now the technology is, hey, here's a bunch of things that I've been doing. And this is something that if I could do next year, this is how much additional carbon I could be offsetting. How do we get from here to there? And how do we suggest a set of practices that not only offset carbon, but do not take any hit on the yield? Because that is equally important. And lastly, how do we make the ground truth measurements of carbon itself much more accurate? Right now, we have to rely on all of these models, and models require calibration. And often that calibration works only for parts of the world. And if you have to expand to the entire planet, then we need to have really good measurement techniques that are cheap. And we're also working on those. The first problem is, of course, getting the data from the farm to the cloud where it can be analyzed. But unfortunately, most agriculture happens in places where there's no good connectivity. And for that, we have developed a technology which is in the making for 15 years, is this idea that most agriculture happens in places where there's very little television broadcasting. And therefore, most of the television spectrum is actually free to use. So we've developed a new kind of Wi-Fi technology that uses unutilized TV spectrum to transmit Wi-Fi signals for long distances. The second problem is that of sensing. To be able to measure accurately, we need really good sensing technology, but sensing is expensive. Deploying these sensors every few feet and getting the data from there to the cloud is expensive. So how do we deal with sparse sensor deployment, not only relying on sensor innovations, which get the information without actually having to dip anything in the soil? For instance, we are working on a technology to use Wi-Fi signals themselves to measure what is going on in the farm, as opposed to deploying actual physical sensors into the soil. Using sparse sensor deployments and generating data as if you had a dense sensor deployment is another problem that we've solved. But to get there, we need to have really good aerial imagery, because aerial imagery is how we draw the correlation between a sparse sensor deployment and a dense one. We take aerial imagery and we combine that with sensors, and we generate, using artificial intelligence, a precision heat map as if you had an infinite number of sensors, or a large number of sensors for that matter, right? And that's an innovation technique that allows you to measure your farm much more accurately without having to spend a lot on sensors. At the same time, one of the problems with aerial imagery is that especially satellite imagery, is that 77% of the planet is covered in clouds at any point of time, which means that you either have to rely on drones, which is super expensive, or you have to figure out a way to remove clouds from satellite imagery. And we have built artificial neural networks, artificial intelligence models to do precisely that. We rely on multiple different kinds of satellite bands. Few of them penetrate through the cloud, and we use that as a way to extrapolate or to interpolate how satellite images would look like if there were no clouds. And you're seeing a live demo of that on the right-hand side over here. The next set of technologies that we have are around better sensing and better predictions. One of the key ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to get the right kind of fertilizer at the right kind of time, in the right kind of places, as opposed to applying large amounts of fertilizer everywhere. Fertilizer is a significant source of methane emissions and nitrogen-related emissions that contribute to greenhouse gas. So the idea over here is that if we're able to predict what the weather on the farm is going to look like, then we can pick the ideal conditions, the weather conditions for which the fertilizer can have the most amount of effect, which means that we can reduce the amount of fertilizer that is used for having the same outcomes. And for that, you need to have really good weather predictions. And most places, again, farming where it happens, weather predictions are not great. So we've built a microclimate forecasting methodology that relies on weather predictions, supercomputing style accurate weather predictions, but significantly less number of resources by building neural network models as opposed to large scale simulation models for weather predictions. However, Getting all of this data to the cloud is another challenge. TV white spaces can get the data from a central location to a farm, but getting the data from the farm to the cloud can be challenging as well, because most farmers do not have an internet connection, which means that you need to have a technology that is running directly on the farm, and that's what you're seeing here. I don't want to go into the details of this, but the idea is that we can run all of these technologies directly on the farm or in the cloud. We intelligently pick where the data is available, where the insights are needed just in time, and run them where they're needed. What you're looking at here is our carbon-based estimation model. It's one of the many models that we run on the edge, which is on the location in the farm or in the cloud, to be able to help farmers estimate their carbon footprint much more accurately in a much more affordable manner. And of course, we've been deploying our technologies widely since 5 years now. It's deployed in several locations in the US, some parts in Africa as well. Farm sizes ranging from 0.5 acre to 9,000 acres. And we have several partners, drones, satellite vendors, and sensor boxes, infrared cameras to capture all of this information and provide these insights directly to the farmers. So where we're going from here is primarily to a place where sensing is much more affordable. Analytics based on what you're sensing is also much more affordable, and helping put numbers on carbon, yield, and helping farmers make a balanced decision between carbon credits that they're generating and the main crop that they're growing. Increasingly, farmers are realizing that they're growing two things at the same time, the main crop and the carbon credits, but one cannot come at the expense of the other. If you overly optimize for credits, your yield might fall down, which means that you might eventually need more deforestation to get the yield back up. And that is not something that we want. It's penny wise, pound foolish, right? But at the same time, if you overly optimize for yield, agrobiodiversity is all about maintaining the yield, but also being sustainable at the same time. But it needs to be measured. So if you overly optimize for the yield, you might take a hit on the sustainability and credits. How do we strike the right balance for the entire earth? Good technology and tools can help solve that, but it's only part of the equation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anirudh, and thanks also for jumping in a bit out of turn. Appreciate your readiness there. Marcela, if you would be available to go ahead and just pick up where you left off, I invite you back on.
Sure. Can you hear me now well?
Very well.
Perfect. I just changed my connection now. So no, and I think this is actually better because after listening the presentation of Anirudh, it also makes me to make the point I want to make today. And is that today I want to talk very briefly on where we see the role of science for innovation and science for development in this interface between science and business, science and private sector engagement. And I want to share with you some thoughts that we have been brainstorming internally in our organization about where is our role in that interface. And I want to share this today with you because, as Clea said, there is a need for a better alignment between both sectors, or probably I will say three sectors: the policy, the research, and the investment or private sector sector. And then for that alignment, I think it's good that we share how we see ourselves playing a role in that interface. So I want to share with you how we see our role, because probably it's not in the same way that the private sector has been seen as playing a role in this interface. And probably that also can help to the discussion that we will have following these presentations. So to start with this, I only want to share one slide right now. But hold on, here it is. So here I want to start by saying that, I mean, when we talk about science for innovations and science for development, we always see private sector as a key player because we acknowledge that the private sector has great influence in the economy and is also then responsible for steering the development towards a sustainable direction. And we are working towards sustainable food systems and landscapes and so on. So that's why it is that we are now looking a lot on how we play a better role in that interface between business and science. So this is with one slide, what came out from that internal conversation that we have with different scientists and project leaders from our organizations. Many of them already working with the private sector, as Tiffany mentioned it during my introduction. So we said, okay, if we want to play better in that interface between science and business, where are the opportunities to do that and to contribute better? So we identified that we have like a zero stage, and it's developing a common vision that is along the lines of what Clea was already saying, how we align better the concepts, the way to work together and so on. But also not how we align both sectors, but also how we align within research groups. So when you talk with scientists, they see their role in this interface very differently, depending where they are coming from and so on. So I think we need in science to develop a common vision on that one. And then after that, we were saying, okay, I think we were identified based on our current experience that we can have also two contributions into potential roles. One as a market player and one as a market builder. So this is really thinking beyond just providing technologies or providing information, but playing a more proactive role in this interface. So in the market player, okay, there is one role that has to be with the independent evaluation and impact assessment that has been more or less the most common role that we have been playing when working and interacting with businesses, with private sector. And of course, there we have been working, for example, on assessing what is the socioeconomic impact of private sector investment in small farmers, for example, or right now we are working in Brazil, assessing how different business models are contributing or not to the conservation of biodiversity in the Amazon. So that role is kind of the most usual when you think about the role of science in this. But there are two others where we are already start playing a role, but I think we still need to kind of steer that role better. So that one is as an investor and more than an investor is like facilitating some investments. So right now, for example, in Brazil, we are channeling some funds from investors to a portfolio of investment that we have been helping to create with different private companies in the Amazon of Brazil. So, and also we have been working with also financial organizations to develop better financial tools, and that incorporate better also science evidence. So this is one role that sometimes is not very explicit, and where we are not, we are demonstrating we can play a good role, especially linking that interface between investment and investment portfolio. And the third one, more related with market building, is that also we are kind of playing more like a neutral role in developing accelerator programs that are designed based on science evidence, but also based on the network that we have been creating with different companies, but also with the beneficiaries of those investments, like small farmers on the ground. So there we are also right now testing an acceleration program in the Amazon, where we want kind of close that gap between an investment decision and an investment need on the ground. So this is something I wanted to share with you, because probably we can discuss this later in the panel. And I would like to see if people coming from the private sector seeing the role of science also in this way, or there is also a gap between those expectations on where is the role of science in this. So here I want to stop with this, Tiffany, and open also the floor for the following part of this meeting.
Great, Marcela. That's actually a great segue into some of the questions that we've prepared. So thanks for doing the summary also of the meta research. We would now like to invite all of the panelists to come forward. We'll spend a little bit of time on some questions that we've prepared for you, and then move to questions from the audience. So those of you watching today can use this opportunity to think of your own questions that you would like to ask our panelists here today. Feel free to put them in, and if we don't get to them today on the live session, our panelists can also follow up with you through the Whova platform. So this is an ongoing asynchronous conversation beyond just this time period. If there is someone in specific that you would like to direct your question to, please make sure to say that when you write the question. Otherwise, we will guess, and we might guess wrong. If it is open to the panelists, then we can also just put it out there and have volunteers to take the questions. So we really want to dig deeper. We've heard a broad range of perspectives from our diverse panelists. I love the mix that we have today. I think we have a very good representation. And we now want to go in a bit deeper on the role of science and collaborations between research and business to transform our global food production system. We have this strong focus on climate and climate change, GHG reduction. Now it's transitioning into resilience. And as we know, with biodiversity being that hot topic that's on the horizon, but not yet really achieving the kind of large scale awareness that it deserves, what is the role of business leaders and research leaders to really be responsible stewards of what we know about the importance of biodiversity? So if you don't mind, I'll start with you, Clea. You've had the most time to recover since your intervention. And we heard also in the last roundtable about policy instruments to encourage businesses to transition to more agrobiodiverse systems. I would really like to know your perspective, given your long experience in the private sector and also your role now in convening CEOs from across agribusinesses. What do you think? What are the policy instruments that would help make your job easier in advocating for this transition?
That is a complex question. And I was smiling when you said biodiversity, and it's absolutely a rising area of focus. And from a practical perspective, we are increasingly focusing as WBCSD on the interlinked agenda between climate, nature, and equity. And from a simplified version, talking around nature often comes across easier than biodiversity, which can actually appear much more technical, which is interesting when you think about it. But just sharing what I've been observing. When I look at it, maybe nature has maybe more of an emotional component to people, or they feel that they can connect more to it from a personal opinion side. Practically speaking, what I can share is that we have seen an increased interest, and I think you will have here the business community speak loud and clear about the importance of science. Like topics of science, scientific standards, we need science-based recommendations is incredibly important. And what has helped so much in the climate agenda is that there has been a concrete goal that everybody has agreed on, that is science-based, and the 1.5 that can help basically rally stakeholders. And where people can also say, okay, I have to measure, I have to perform, I can be held accountable. And what we are increasingly looking at, and I will put also the link in the chat here, it is around how do we hold business accountable for the commitments that they've set, and how can they be measured? So on the national determined contributions, looking at data, but also what are the goals that companies have set themselves, how they will, and how can we, what kind of framework, independent framework exists to hold companies accountable. So I'll set something, I'll put some link in what we are asking for in the climate manifesto around that. What I do want to mention though, and we need to be, at least if we talk about food systems, and I mentioned this also on climate and nature, we need to think about it in a systems perspective. So example, when we talk about, and when we think around biodiversity, are we also thinking about nutrition? Are we also thinking about ecosystems and livelihoods, not just around, let's say, environment or caloric intake? Systems approaches are much more complex. And there you're thinking, okay, we really need some science and some scientific guidance to help bring us together. So that is kind of where I wanted to focus on. I can share a little bit more on the on more specific examples, but I do think that from the business side, to summarize your question, you would see a very strong interest in scientific collaboration, greater alignment around science. And when we think about it from a global, national, or regional perspective, and then local perspective, really interest in global frameworks and the role of science there, and kind of the path that it can set, which can then lead into national strategies, for example, where you have the interface between science, civil society, and business working together, and then local implementation. And I loved Anirudh's example where it was like, this is what we can do on the local farm, and this is where it's happening, right? And this is where the technology, and that's where business can really step in. But what's extremely useful from a business perspective, it's also having that global framework, that global alignment that can ensure level playing fields, greater alignment around trust, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And that is a perfect transition into my question for Anirudh. We've heard a lot today about scientific innovations in production, more from a technology perspective, as well as more traditional research in agriculture. I want to know your thoughts. What do you think are the most important factors that enable scientific innovation like these that are maybe very early stage to make it to the point where they're taken up by the business sector?
One of the things that we are realizing more and more as we are taking digital transformation tools to sectors that are traditionally, not being in the cloud, right? Sectors that, either because of cost or because of, lack of technological innovations have been, how do I say this? Like not as technologically advanced as other fields. For instance, is that tools for measurement and tools for taking these measurements and converting them to actionable insights is where it's been lagging. And one of the things that we have realized is that yes, tools can be great, but what we are actually missing is in terms of getting the traditional agricultural scientists and thinking into better informing our tools and our solutions. And one example, I go back what Clea was mentioning earlier is nutrition. All of this has to have nutrition built in. And when we are talking about nutrition, these measurements have to now be much more accurate in terms of, sure, I'm optimizing for yield, I'm optimizing for carbon credits, but what does it do for nutrition? Because if nutrition goes down, consumption goes up. And that at the same time takes us back to the same deforestation problem, which is again, sort of, like penny wise, pound foolish. So solving this problem holistically requires all of us to work together in terms of understanding what's the right kind of measurement tools we require, holistic measurement tools, and understanding where we're falling short and building those solutions. So it has to come from a collaboration across different fields, all the way from agtech to traditional agricultural science to fintech, to understand where the markets are and to understand what market-driven solutions can help us. For instance, one of the things that we are seeing is carbon credits are great because they can be quantified and there's a lot of demand for them. But we also need some way of putting some sort of value on sustainable practices, right? Because there's a demand for that too. We want to preserve the quality of the soil. We want to preserve the quality of our waterways, the forests, etc. And farming that can strike the balance between yield and sustainable practices, that has value in the market. But how do we put a value on that? For instance, any farmer who treats their water running off of the farm before it reaches a waterway, they're doing a significant amount of good for the society. How do we put a credit on that? And how do we compare that to another farmer who is following a very different kind of sustainable practice, growing grass in the waterways, for instance, so that the water remains near the fields as opposed to running off. So both of these things are very different, but equally useful. So how do we put credits on? When it has to come from understanding the impact on the environment, and that needs to be quantified, measured. So it needs to come as a collaboration between technology, finance, the markets, and of course, the core of all of this problem is traditional environmental sciences and agriculture sciences. That has to happen, this cross collaboration between all of these sciences.
Great, thank you for that. I imagine, I see Marcela unmuting, so I imagine that she has some thoughts to share, and I would really like to hear your thoughts, Emma, after Marcela speaks also on these questions. And it's kind of a challenge that Anirudh has raised, right? How do we put more research and science-based evidence into our tools and technologies? And I think that's a great question. So if you don't mind, Marcela, could you go ahead and take a stab?
Okay, good, Tiffany. Okay, I was not unmuting for that, but that's fine. No, but that's good. I mean, I think, the positive news is that there is a recognition, as we are listening today, of the need and relevance of science to make better investments, right, in agriculture, for example. That's a good news. We don't have really right now kind of advocating for that, because there is already a recognition of that need. And also from the science perspective, as I was sharing today, we also acknowledge the need that we have to start working closely with, for example, the private sector to be our science more impactful. The point, I think, the gap is in the middle, because we have those intentions there, very positive and very clear, but I think we need, from the science to be more expedite in some way, to do the piloting, the testing, and the trialing of those science-based tools and technologies. And by making those more expedite, making them more ready for the uptake of investors, right? And then I think we need as we want to accelerate the investment, we also need to accelerate sometimes the science. And we already have evidence and so on. So it's like we don't have to start from zero. So that's from the science perspective. Now, from the business perspective, what I have been learning, at least in the projects where we are working with private sector in new business models, is that we need scientists to be more involved in the dialogue when designing new business models. So sometimes the designing of those business models happening more between the trading alliance, for example, farmers organizations and the buyer. But I think we can play a role in the middle to make sure that in the value proposition of those business models, biodiversity, for example, biodiversity commitments or other environmental commitments are at the core of the value proposition. So it means that at the end, everything else that is agreed in the business models is also oriented to what is in that core value proposition. So sometimes you find things related with price, with productivity, but also in that core value proposition, you need to include those environmental commitment and not setting that something like a side of what is in the core of that business model. So I think that's also needed. And also there is a gap that I found many times when I discuss with investors, and is that they said, okay, what tool do you have? What technology you have? But sometimes we don't have those ready, especially for things like biodiversity right now, that we are developing now a tool for assessing the contribution of private sector engagement to biodiversity conservation. We knew how to do it, but it was not done. But private sector wants that ready, right? Already tested, already piloted. So who is doing that pre-investment? And there is a gap there. And to be honest, there are few private investors that are ready to do that pre-investment. Probably it's not the role. Probably it's the role more of the investors in science. But we need to find a way to fill that gap for that pre-investment to include science and new tools that are not out there.
Great points. Thank you, Marcela. Emma, did you want to chime in on that one?
Yes, I really like your perspective, Marcela, on who carries the responsibility of building those tools. And I can shine a little light on what we've done at Rabobank. We found an article roughly published 2 years ago where there was speculation on the use of remote sensing to measure year-on-year biomass sequestration, especially on small farms. And what we've done is take a big gamble and actually try it ourselves. We've worked together with research-based partners who are really innovative in their field. Satellite parties, remote sensing experts, and we've basically collected, let's call it copious amounts of ground truth data to just see if we can actually do this small scale year-on-year growth, just to start with carbon sequestration. But I can say from a banking perspective, corporate innovation carries different risks than startups, for example. Corporate innovation, of course, has traditionally more to spend. However, there's bigger risks if everything goes wrong. So seeing what we could achieve by taking the gamble with this approach has been great. And I think Annie can definitely recognize that from Microsoft as well. Having resources beyond what would necessarily be available in the research areas, just because you're in corporate innovation. And because it worked for us, we could tie a business case to it. We said, if this works out, then we have a business model ready. And that's how we were able to make this investment. Luckily, it all panned out. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today. So at the same time, we're looking at similar things. How can we quantify, not using remote sensing necessarily, other ecosystem services, like you mentioned? I think that is, it's been mentioned many times, crucial, especially with the low data situation, the low investment cost that we want to make for smaller farmers, because that's still the core focus. So I love these classic institutes that are venturing into completely new areas of research to quantify biodiversity. And I think a great example I've heard is mapping out bird sounds, because birds are a great indication of biodiversity, of all the species that grow there in terms of plants, insects, and it's easier to collect a little sound sample on the ground than to go and count all the birds or any other indicator for biodiversity. So those types of initiatives really give us hope to be able to pay all the smallholders that are within our network, also for other ecosystem services. And I think we're really, as a Rabobank, we are counting on innovation in that sense. If we find anything that can work with us to enable payments for ecosystem services for these farmers, we're happily collaborating with that. But we're counting on the fact that within 3 to 5 years will be available for biodiversity as well. So it's really been at the core of how we help these farmers design their transition to regenerative agriculture, and specifically agroforestry. You can say agroforestry is inherently biodiverse compared to monoculture. However, there are so many gradients of a truly healthy, resilient, regenerative system. And our assumption has been, if we lose a little bit of money now, as suggesting more systems optimized for not just carbon, because if you want to optimize for carbon, you plant a eucalyptus forest. But any biologist here knows that eucalyptus doesn't do very well with other species, so it lowers your biodiversity. It doesn't really attract a healthy regenerative system. So basically focusing on how can we help these farmers transition to a healthy system that carries an inherent value to these farmers beyond the carbon payments. assuming that we can start compensating them in the future as soon as these new measurements go online in a scalable and costly fashion. We can incorporate those. And I think this is a big call for anyone listening. Do your best, because there are definitely partners available to work with you.
Thank you, Emma. There are lots of calls to action from our panelists today, so I hope people are feeling inspired and motivated. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so maybe I'll ask just one more question, open it up to the room. Please feel free to put your hand up or just jump in, and we can go in order of whoever starts speaking first, as you like. And then we'll switch over to some of the questions coming in from our audience today. So just to wrap us up, I'd really like to hear your high-level ideas from a business sector perspective. If we're looking at business sector as the agents, understanding they're not the only agents who are going to move us to agrobiodiversity and production, but from their perspective, what do you see as the most significant opportunities to increase agrobiodiverse production systems? And can really be from your own, perspective in your own area of work. It doesn't have to be the answer for all sectors, but really happy to hear your thoughts based on your experience.
I know I've talked for a little bit already, but purely from a banking perspective, I've noticed that investing in smaller farmers has been really tough because the risks are extremely high. And there at the same time is let's call it a large pile of money available worldwide to help support these types of projects because of the purpose behind it. And so what I've learned is that biodiversity in their agricultural systems has been an indicator of very low risk compared to other types of systems. So for any investor looking to invest in these types of projects, I think the risk perspective would be, for me, the first angle. So how can we tie agrobiodiversity to a lower risk compared to other agricultural systems? Yeah, it's the first starting point, and I've seen that already in practice to work out really well. To start discussion here.
Great, thank you. Clea, would you like to go next?
Sure. Actually, building on what Emma was saying, because I think the risk and risk management is a core one, absolutely. And it's not just from an investment perspective, but it has so many angles. And I think, but building on that one is the other lens of it, which would be the innovation and the opportunity one. That is something that I think complements it really well. And what I've seen from a business perspective, where either you look at some startups or innovators, almost called, or some larger companies, when they find and when they see the clear opportunity in there, an opportunity also from a business perspective, it can be a very powerful force. So I think that's also where the opportunity of that science to business collaboration can really make sense. I'm in Switzerland right now, and we are quite close to EPFL and again, WBCSD has no affiliation to them. I'm just thinking practically, they're really down the road. And you see this hub central around it of companies, of innovators, and so on. And also in the food and agriculture space, it's a growing area, and you almost read something in the news on a day-by-day basis. I think if we can link that science perspective in some way or another with the innovation and business perspective, at the same time keeping environment and keeping the public good also core and central. It cannot be not just about the highest profit possible and the high, it has to be what I was mentioning earlier. We need to look at society, we need to look at environment, and we need to look at business in a balance. But somehow if that whole risk side can be counterbalanced with that innovation and opportunity side, it could make a very powerful case for agrobiodiversity. And you're seeing it in so many other spaces already, where there's almost no competition for what can we do, that it could be very powerful. It links to other issues, of course, right? How do you ensure diversity of companies participating across the food and agriculture supply chain, regional diversity? We cannot just think about European or American issues, but it's so great to have voices from Latin America here, etc. So there are other topics to think about, and I don't want to overanalyze it, but I think from a simplified perspective, that component of risk and managing the risk factor together with that innovation and opportunity space could be very powerful.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Clea.
So,
Anirudh, would you like to? Yeah, please.
Yeah, Tiffany, you said something along the lines of, personally also, one of the things that I feel more recently is food is a great way to connect with, like everyone who was involved in the process of, getting that from seed to the plate, where I'm eating my food. It is something that personally I've been trying to do is, mindful eating as I'm eating something, trying to imagine where the food came from, who grew it, who transported it, who was, putting it in the shelves over there, and who was labeling all of these things, processing plants, who was working there. So I think, when it comes to food, there are so many labels on the food, because food is not just about, hunger for people. It's not just also about taste or calories. These are ways to measure these things, but food is about, so much beyond this. And there is real customer demand in terms of food being a channel for being connected to the world. Right? And if we can quantify this demand in terms of, how can we help people feel more connected to the world through food, I think there is an unmet demand there. And it has to come through, again, innovation and measurement in terms of understanding what is it that people are asking for in terms of food when they're going and spending all this time in shopping aisles or on their mobile apps for shopping. What are they looking for, right? They're looking for labels, they're looking for taste, they're looking for nutrition, they're looking for how their eating is affecting the world. If we can somehow perhaps understand these needs in a holistic manner, there is a business opportunity. Because sometimes I do buy more expensive stuff because I feel like, this is something that will bring me the additional satisfaction of, being a more responsible person on planet. I don't know, maybe I think that it's better tasting, or it is more healthy, more nutritious. I'm thinking all of these things when I'm buying something for eating. So, I think there's a great business opportunity there. And if we are to see how many of the organic brands, in spite of being more expensive, are more profitable also, I think there's a story to tell there. There is some learnings to have there, for sure.
Great, thank you. I do appreciate that personal perspective, for sure. Marcela, would you like to share your thoughts on the biggest priorities to bring agrobiodiversity and agrobiodiverse production systems into the business sector as well?
Yes, I was thinking as I was listening to Emma and Pia on the risk management, and I was wondering, probably we as scientists need to understand better what is the main priority of private sector, for example, in terms of risk management. Because I was thinking for example, in family farms here in Latin America. And we have been working on more agrobiodiverse systems like agroforestry, silvopastoral systems. And what I have seen is that, this is based on the evidence we have and our understanding, is that the risk is even lower than with their business as usual systems that were more extractive, that were less efficient, that et cetera. So I don't know if there is actually a gap there where also scientists need to play a better role in communicating better the evidence and also putting that in the context of risk management and show in what cases and in what cases don't the risk is reduced with more agrobiodiverse systems. Because it seems to me that there is a perception that bringing agrobiodiversity could bring more risk to the system. So I don't know if we should work that better with evidence and see, probably in some cases, yes, but probably in some cases not, because it depends on the baseline. Sometimes the smallholders farming is already high risk. So whatever you do to improve it should reduce the risk, not increase the risk. So probably I'm thinking that one top priority could be along those lines, and how we are understanding better how risk is changing when you bring more agrobiodiverse systems. And I think we have the elements, but we haven't had this conversation, and I would like to understand better from your perspective, what would you like to see in terms of risk management? And what do you think investors would like to see in terms of risk for making an investment decision?
Clea, could you please go ahead?
Yeah, and then Emma, you on the risk side more. What I just wanted to add to that is it's not just on the, I mean, you mentioned smallholder farmers a lot and how to link them more in agrobiodiversity and so on. There are often other issues that might not be just financial risk, but do add to risk and to the overall operating risk. For example, things like infrastructure. You need access to infrastructure, cold chains, right? All these supply chain challenges, transportation. Is it going to be something that is grown and sold within a certain region, within national boundaries, or shipped around the world? All of these challenges all add risk also. So it's not just the price risk and talking, let's say, about commodities that are being traded and where you need to add a certain risk management element, or is there a market for products? Often there is, but it is often very practical issues about actually doing businesses on the ground that smallholder farmers can be facing, but also companies that want to engage in that space. So that adds to that element, because we've seen case studies after case studies where it really makes the just act of doing business much more complicated.
If I may jump very briefly on that, I love hearing that, Clea, because sometimes, because we are in the middle of we were just in the COP26 and so on, when we talk about risk management, we tend to focus a lot on managing climate risk and not managing that operational risk that is implicit in some of the contexts where we work. So yeah, thanks for bringing that.
Yeah, fully agree, Clea. One more risk that I really like actually is completely from a Rabobank perspective, because we're a bank and often prone to very rigorous assessments by journalists who really want to see us fall. And like the banking sector as a whole sees that happening a lot. So for us, a risk that I personally like for the Acorn proposition is the risk that someone will consider it greenwashing and therefore will completely tear the proposition down. It doesn't even matter if it's actually greenwashing or if it's perceived as greenwashing. At the point where someone can make that claim, it's done. And so I think that risk really comes from public perception on what should be done for these smallholders, right? So it's not even a financial risk, because yeah, we can tie a financial number to it. But for us, we are kept on our toes by journalists, by the public. And I think that's a great movement because, well, let's say 5 years ago, I wouldn't have expected the general public to care so much about how their cocoa was grown. Was it in a monoculture? An example of the Tony Chocolonely, which is a Dutch brand, has created huge waves in the cocoa market, where before it wasn't a topic. We'll call it slave-free cocoa. So I see also a big role here for agrobiodiversity is what are you actually promoting as a company? And what are you contributing to that's not necessarily financial risk, but perceived by people as risky? And I think that is the second point that I see happening here is risk, of course, is tied to your time frame of how do you look at the world, to what extent? Like I see the world in two axes. What's your scope? Do you see look at the world from only my perspective, or do you consider the entire planet? Like that's one axis. And then the other one is time. do I think about now? Do I think about my governmental position that lasts for 4 years? Do I think about 50 years in the future, the planet I leave to my children? What is your perspective on time? And I think looking at risk from a financing perspective, we see a movement towards a more long-term thinking that is also new to me. Looking at, for example, the taxonomy from the European Union on what is a sustainable investment, what is that actually? But also looking at Winrock, for example, who's really pushing all of their investment projects to, well, report on sustainability. So I think time here is a huge factor, and there I see a big role for science because they're not necessarily pressed for time as much as the private sector is. However, if they can show what the long-term implications are of a short-term thinking model, like Annie said, penny-wise, pound foolish, I think that's a great example where business and science can really collaborate. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah,
Great
so
discussion. Yeah, please go ahead, Anirudh.
I was just quickly, wanted to add that I see a lot of questions in the chat around, risks around technology, right? Many of these technologies are cutting edge, so the cost could be higher, which means that they could be out of reach for many, smallholder farmers, especially. The risk and credit go hand in hand. It's all about return on investment. When financiers are thinking of whether this technology makes sense for this farmer or not. One extreme example of this is creditors are completely sold on the idea of tractors. Right? That is why there's huge amount of financing. When you're going and buying tractors, the risk is understood. 99.9% of the investments that creditors make on tractors, they get the return on investment because they know that this is fundamental in terms of getting outcomes. Right? How do we evolve the nascent technology tools from here to there, where the risk is understood, the benefits are understood, such that the ROI is there? Many of the solutions right now that we're developing in research, yes, the cost could be high, but it could also be primarily because the scale isn't there. But once the scale comes in, the risk could be understood. But for us to go from here to there in terms of taking research tools to understand what works at scale, there's a significant amount of practicing that has to catch up, and that has to happen with digital transformation, and that comes with its own risks, right? So I think the kinds of risks that we have to take will continue to evolve, and the hope that we'll eventually come to a place where these digital transformation tools for agriculture are considered as safe a bet, or as affordable as a tractor is. Right? Tractors may not be affordable, but there is crediting that makes it affordable, and where the ROI becomes very clear.
Great. This is fabulous. Unfortunately, we have burned through the time that we had for audience questions, but the good news is that those questions live on Whova and you can respond to them at any time. And I think it's totally worth it because your inputs and discussion just now was on fire, really great. I really enjoyed having you guys here today. So please encourage you to take a few more minutes after the session to go and respond in writing and maybe set up conversations with particular audience members. I think, Anirudh, there were quite a few questions for you. So please do that. And before we wrap up the session today, we'll have Immaculada join us from the International Development Law Organization and give us a perspective from the legal side on how we can use policy and business sector interventions to support biodiverse production systems. So thank you very much for your participation today. It was thoroughly enjoyable. Over to you, Immaculada.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Today, I will share with you some thoughts on the rule of law to increase agrobiodiversity in food production. Let me very quickly explain who we are, because the International Development Law Organization is the only global intergovernmental organization exclusively devoted to promote the rule of law to advance sustainable development and peace. We work to enable governments and empower local communities to reform laws and strengthen institutions to promote peace, justice, sustainable development, and economic opportunities. Today, discussion has been focusing on the private sector engagement and the role of science in agrobiodiversity conservation and sustainable production systems and practices. But from a rule of law perspective, there is a critical element for smallholder producers, farmers, and the private sector, but in particular SMEs, to engage in innovative production systems and practices, and it is the access to production resources, and in particular land, as an asset that can also contribute to reduce some financial risk in finance for SMEs or smallholder producers. Access to land and natural resources, including water and seeds, is a vital component for agrobiodiversity and food system transformation. Secure land tenure for local communities contribute to climate, agrobiodiversity outcomes. Indigenous community and held land is associated with low deforestation rates, high carbon storage, and high biodiversity. I'm not quite sure if you followed yesterday this rule of law approach to agrobiodiversity, but there are three main elements of the rule of law that can enable sustainable transformation of food systems and make them, let's say, fair, equitable, and inclusive when it applies to food production. First is an enabling environment which allows SMEs and smallholder farmers, and especially women, youth, indigenous people, to have access to production resources, nature-based solutions, and finance with sound, legal, and equal regulatory frameworks which are inclusive along the food value chains. Second is that institutions should have tools and skills to effectively implement that laws and regulations and administrative processes to act with transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to securing the right to land or other natural resources and financing mechanisms. And finally, many contexts or in many countries, land and natural resources are governed by pluralist legal systems that include customary laws grounded in traditional practices. In these cases, it is essential to engage equally with statutory and traditional institutions on conflict resolution while ensuring their alignment with international human rights standards. These statutory and customary laws and informal justice systems should be strengthened to promote fair and inclusive conflict resolution mechanisms on land rights with communities and vulnerable and marginalized groups, especially indigenous people, women, and youth, legally empowered to be aware of and claim for their rights, and also to be part of the decision-making processes on land rights. Engaging with both statutory and customary systems can enhance land dispute resolutions mechanisms for just, sustainable, and inclusive development. For example, in Rwanda, we are working to identify barriers affecting access to land justice for local communities and to develop capacities of local actors in formal and informal land dispute resolution mechanisms. On the other hand, on our report, Women, Food, Land, Exploring the Rule of Law Linkages, the report stressed that rights for women and vulnerable groups must be also supported by coordinated and coherent legal and policy framework grounded in participatory approaches. We will share with you this link in any case, but participatory and inclusive land dispute resolution mechanisms linked with institutions that implement transparent land registration processes, for example, are key to promote SMEs and smallholder producers' access to production input, to finance and technologies that can boost their science-based, nature-based solutions and to enhance agrobiodiversity for the sustainable transformation of food systems. Thank you very much, and back to you, Tiffany.
Thank you, Immaculada. And thanks to all of our speakers today. It was probably the most fun I've ever had on a panel discussion. So note to self to play a moderator role as opposed to a speaker role and have the opportunity to listen to everyone. I think we covered a lot of ground today. In Roundtable 1, we heard about how biodiverse systems can lower input costs, improve soil microbiodiversity and carbon content at the same time. We learned about the role of standards and bottom-up aggregation of smallholder groups and participant groups and producer groups to start bringing greater awareness to biodiverse production systems and increasing the value of agrobiodiverse products in the market. And we learned about the role for private sector and especially the banking sector to play a matching role in matching funds and this growing awareness and increasing amount of investment that is being made available to improved production systems, including more agrobiodiverse ones. And the role of bankers to play that role in matching those funds to the companies, big or small, that are investing in these production systems. We heard that there's actually a lot of good policy and good regulatory frameworks that are out there. We just need to put them into action. And I think that's where the Roundtable 2 today brought some really nice, dynamic and challenging ideas that we should all take forward as our call to action, our rallying cry, if you may, going forward. How can we make it more obvious how agrobiodiverse systems reduce risk? There are questions on whether or not they actually reduce risk beyond the production, but also into the supply chain, and how are we looking at those trade-offs? Better collaboration between research, science, and business sector. There are already platforms that are out there, such as WBCSD, that are providing us some structures with which we can increase that kind of collaboration. And with Clea really echoing what we heard in the first roundtable, science and policy needs to work hand in hand with business for the kind of impact that we need for biodiverse production systems to become a reality in the next 5 to 10 year timeline that we really need to make some dynamic change. And we also heard a lot on technology and the role of innovation in the banking sector and in technology sector from Emma and Anurad from Microsoft and Rabobank. So there we really see some real life examples of how technology can go from something as basic as a journal publication speculating about the potential of a technology, all the way to receiving some pre-investment and then commercial level investment to take products to market. So some very nice examples that it can be done, and the role of research in that transition. So I just want to say a huge thank you for all of the dynamic ideas that were shared today, and encourage everyone to continue the conversation on the Whova platform. Reach out. Our speaker bios are all there, and you have the ability to contact them directly. So let's carry this forward and take up the challenge together. Thank you for your time today.